Hey there. Tonight we're going far back, not to palaces or marble temples, but to a time of gods, monsters and mortals who wandered through a world shaped by fate and fire. You'll drift through a story rooted in Egyptian mythology. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there falling asleep to the same old stories. So, dim the lights, let the gods whisper, let the myths unfold, and let's begin. Akhet's first floodwater shimmered like hammered copper as it slid past Thebes. A scribe named Nesamun dipped a reed in black ink to copy his lesson. Water begins the world. Teachers said every story is a small creation rising from none that cradles light. They told how Atum lifted himself upon the primeval mound, how the Benben shone like morning stone, and how names fastened shape to dark. Drums rolled along the river. The Opet procession had begun. Priests bent beneath the bark of Amun, its gold bright as noon. Shaven heads moved in time beneath banners of the Theban triad. Amun was veiled in linen, Mut guarded like a lioness, and Khonsu kept the night's measure. The avenue from Karnak to Luxor was swept and strewn with palm fronds. Chalked prayers whitened the dust. Nesamun's mother had been a singer in the house of Amun, and the city kept her explanations. During Opet, the king was renewed, joined with the gods so the land's breath continued. The flood was not only water, it was time turning like a crocodile. As the procession entered the forest of columns, shades striped the bark and it rocked like a cradle. The festival rehearsed a covenant that kept fields green and calendars sure. Another rhythm threaded the din, the scratch of chisels and murmured recitations drifting from the western hills where the craftsman S village held its narrow lanes. Deir el-Medina's doors shared walls, and its streets ran straight as ruled lines. Foremen tallied days with ostraca. Sculptors drew faces from stone. Painters ground malachite to green the afterlife, and families counted time by how quickly limestone yielded to skilled hands. A foreman once let Nesamun hold a heart scarab, deep green and polished until it drank the sun. Tiny rows of signs ran along its underside, words that quiet a heart when it faces the balance in the hall of two truths. Do not stand against me, the spell asked. Do not bar me from fields where grain bows and canals glitter. Such amulets argued before a scale that weighed a life against a feather. By midday, the procession reached the cool breath of Luxor. Dancers shook Sistra until the courtyard felt like rain. A breeze lifted the fringes of the canopy veiling the god's image, and the air thickened as if a doorway opened. Beyond the columns, the king would take the god's hand and pass through his chamber. In the pillar-S shade, the scribe steadied his breath, while the city seemed to inhale and hold. A girl watched him there with the measuring gaze of a craftswoman. Her skin held the color of dusted hills, and her forearms showed the quiet strength of grinding pigment smooth. She carried a cloth-wrapped bundle and said her mother had dreamed of a scribe who listened. Dreams mattered in Egypt. Temples kept manuals for their reading. She unrolled the cloth and placed a small wooden figure in his palm. The figure was a shapti, a servant for the field of reeds. No ink yet marked its legs. Hands crossed its chest. A tiny hoe rested on a carved shoulder as if it had paused at work. The girl said his hand must teach the figure its name. Work lay ahead that needed more than one life. The sleepers were restless. Her voice carried no heat, as calm as a plasterer saying a wall must dry before color clings. Custom would dismiss such talk. The sleepers had bread and beer, shade and songs, boats and orchards painted so real they seemed to fruit. The balance was fair and the field generous. Yet unease moved under the scribe's ribs, like a quail in papyrus. He turned the shapti and imagined its lines. Here I am when you call me, to irrigate fields, to ferry boats, to catch fish. The girl touched the wood, then drew back as if it were warm. Night fell. The Nile turned to ink and frogs stitched the edges of darkness with bright calls. Thebes rested in the memory of drums. Sleep folded the city like linen. Before dawn, a vision gathered where festival and craft and doctrine meet. The first morning rose again. Water wrinkled and parted around a swelling mound. A heron stood on new ground with a gaze that read the dark. With each sound the bird released, a star trembled into life. The bird became a scarab shouldering the sun. The scarab became a child rising from a lotus. The earth tipped and opened into stairways. Nesamun walked with a candle along corridors painted with fields. Resin and incense sweetened the air. Measured footsteps moved ahead, as if the past led the way. The chamber of weighing opened like an iris, and the scale waited between tenderness and truth. A feather lay on one pan. On the other rested a stone carved with grooves that matched the lines beneath a heart scarab. The room held its breath. A careful voice spoke from the doorway, dry as papyrus rubbed by counting. It belonged to the ibis-headed observer who writes what the beam permits. The voice addressed the moment and everything braided within it. Scribes and singers, carvers and kings, barks and banners, waters and winds. Write, the voice said, because the sleepers are asking for a name. Names are doors, doors are promises. Promises hold worlds the way a reed mat holds grain. The vision thinned like morning mist above canals. The hallway dimmed to stone and the candle breathed. So the festival's day ended with a question under its splendor. Renewal was enacted, the god escorted, the king reborn. Yet a silent Shabti, rumors of restless tombs and a dream balanced on a single feather suggested a story drifting toward Thebes by nightboat. The city did not know its place in that story. It knew only the season had fully turned. The river was very full, and somewhere the sleepers stirred. Morning after the festival rose with reed haze. Thebes resumed its quieter heartbeat. Nesamun kept the Shabti wrapped and walked beneath the ram-headed sphinxes that guard the road between Karnak and Luxor, thinking of messages that travel by wood and by name. The avenue had carried the barks of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu with cheers and clashing sistra. Now pigeons stepped in dust, and the lion stared past him toward the river. Custom demanded counsel. He climbed to Karnak's house of life, the Per Ankh, where papyrus shelves stood behind cedar doors and the rooms smelled of resin. A lector priest named Hori kept catalogues of ritual, medicine, and law. He listened as Nesamun told of the girl, the dream, and the figure. Hori set the bundle on a table polished by many scrolls and unwrapped the Shabti. The carving was spare but sound, a worker's piece. Grain ran true. The little hoe lay against the shoulder. Hori asked who made it. Nesamun answered that a craftswoman from the western village shaped it. Hori nodded and reached for a narrow roll. Chapter 6, he said, the words that make a servant answer when work is called. He would not recite the lines. The house guarded its speech. He summarized the duty. The figure must be named and told to carry baskets, irrigate fields, and ferry boats when summoned. Nesamun repeated the warning about sleepers. Hori's fingers paused on papyrus. Rumors had reached even these rooms. The village had appealed to oracles often, and the god's statue answered with unusual haste. Carriers felt the bark pull before questions were laid down. Libations struck stone with a hard sound. Walls remembered tapping. Hori closed the drawer. Carve the name, he said, then carry it west. Begin with the living hands that shaped it. If the oracles will listen, they will meet you. If not, the work still needs a name. The afternoon path crossed fields rich with new silt. Farmers set chutes into wet furrows, while boys chased birds with rattles. The city thinned to gardens, then to limestone glare. Western cliffs rose in shelves the color of old honey. On this bank, doors faced the rising sun, so each morning life entered with light. Beyond lay a walled settlement built for the king's workmen. doors sharing walls, lanes kept as straight as ruled lines. Gatekeepers knew Nesamun from account tablets. Grain and oil required steady hands. In the foreman's court, a woman pounded blue pigment, her pestle lifting and falling like a metronome. She named herself Merit. She was the messenger's older sister and the Shapti's carver. Their mother had guided the design. Her voice was even and her eyes missed nothing. She poured a jar of cool water and asked him to sit. Their mother, Merit said, would join at sundown. Dreams had left her heavy. In those nights, a procession moved through stone corridors, asking for names that had been forgotten. Not painted names, older ones, the kind used by a grandmother when a child is in trouble. The dreams warned that certain doors had been opened with the wrong key. Nesamun shared Hori's advice and asked what name should be cut. A name must be earned, Merit said. For a servant like this, the right name is found among those who will rely on it. She led him through neat lanes to a workshop where men copied a tomb plan onto flakes of limestone. A boy ground red ochre. A cat watched dust as if it were prey. The room smelled of stone and glue. Elders gathered and considered the figure. One suggested a word for ferry rope. Another proposed a counting phrase used by foremen to keep crews together. The foreman, a thin man with a careful mouth, said the name should be a promise that can be spoken from both sides of a door. He tapped the wood and listened as if expecting an answer. In the pause, Merit's mother entered with a shawl drawn against the wind. She greeted the room with the ease of a temple singer. She studied the figure without touching it and said the name would come when the village spoke its needs to the god. The bark would pass the street within a week. Petitions would be laid beneath its poles. The statue's motion would show which case to hear first. It had always been so. The village kept records of each answer as carefully as it kept records of grain. At dusk, a gathering formed near the gate. Lamps made bowls of light. Men and women spoke in turn. Some asked for relief from shortages. Rations had been late 2 months in a row. Others asked that a wall sealer regain strength after a fever. A mason feared his son's apprenticeship lagged. Near the end, Merit's mother described her dreams. She did not say restless. She said the dead wanted their doors handled with clean hands. The court murmured. Every family had someone in the Western Hills. Caution at thresholds felt right. The foreman decided that when the bark came, the village would ask its questions in a single order, written on potsherds, so the carriers could not be swayed by hearing. First ask if the god would speak, then ask if the delay in rations offended any rule, then ask if a particular door had been opened by mistake. If the god nodded to the last, they would choose a rite and send word to the necropolis guards. Night lowered from the cliffs. Stars gathered over the ridge like seeds on a papyrus head. In a guest house, Nesamun lay awake and listened to the dry quiet. Houses leaned against one another and breathed in unison. He understood that the Shapti no longer felt like a stranger's gift. It belonged to a place where hands knew the weight of stone and the weight of words. He slept and dreamed of water-lifting fields and a rope drawn tight between banks. At sunrise, the village returned to its rhythm. Men walked to the cut, where quarry hands left pale scars across the slope. Women set bread to bake and ground colors in shallow bowls. Children recited signs with careful voices. Nesamun ate dates and warm loaves with Merit's family. The mother traced lines on the table with a fingertip. She told a brief story about a time when workers marched to the temple gate and asked to be paid. The story was old and precise. Delays can bruise a city. Bruises can tempt hands. They worked after breakfast in the courtyard shade. Merit sharpened a small blade on sandstone while Nesamun laid out the columns he would cut beside the name. He would not carve the spell itself. That belonged to the priests' mouths. He planned only the framing lines. The mother watched and hummed a dawn tune. Hours drifted without hurry. At noon, the cat yawned, the pestle tapped. and the Shabti waited between them like a question made of wood. In the heat, Shimmer, an official from the Necropolis Guard, arrived with 2 men. They carried a chipped jar sealed with mud. The official greeted the foreman and set the jar on a bench. It had been taken from a tomb door by boys who should not have been there. Inside lay a folded scrap of linen and a small ostracon with a sketch of a jackal on a standard. The guard wanted the village to witness the return. Doors disliked being opened twice without witness. The foreman glanced at Nesamun and Merit. Perhaps questions would multiply before answers arrived. He raised his hand and asked the scribe to record what was being returned and to write the name that would bind the figure to its promised work. He wrote as the jar's seal broke and as dust lifted in the courtyard light. The linen was stained with resin and a faint breath of incense. The ostracon still held red lines sure as string. The guard bowed and took the jar away. The boys sent ahead to sweep the threshold they had disturbed. In the hush that followed, Merit set the Shabti on the bench as if on a small altar. The village waited for the bark, and the hills seemed to lean closer. That night the wind changed and brought the Niles cool. Lamps flickered and fell to embers. The jackal on the shard watched from its little line world while the wooden servant faced east. Nesamun trimmed his reed and drew a narrow column for a name not yet known. The court smelled of paste and groundstone. In the near dark, a singer cleared her throat and tried a single note, the kind used to call a god kindly to the door. It hung above the courtyard like a thread and faded to silence. Houses settled against one another and breathed in unison. He understood that the Shabti no longer felt like a stranger's gift. It belonged to a place where hands knew the weight of stone and the weight of words. He slept while the village kept watch over its doors tonight. Dawn pulled a pale wash over the western cliffs, and the village woke to its careful rhythm. Bread rose, pestles tapped, and lanes filled with the soft order of hands that knew their work. News crossed rooftops like swallows. The god's bark would pass today. Potsherds lay ready, questions written in red so words would not fade, if breath caught or palms sweated. The order fixed at dusk held firm. First ask whether the god would speak, then ask about rations, then ask about a door. Nesamun checked his reed and ink and walked with Merit and her mother to the shaded lane where the bark would slow. Men tied garlands between doorways. Children were coached to silence and to lower their eyes. The Necropolis Guard arrived with steady formality, jackal badge bright at his chest. He set a small table where petitions would be slid beneath the poles. The younger sister, who had first carried the Shabti, waited behind Merit's elbow, watching the road for the first glint of gold. Heat shimmered above the street as if the air itself expected an answer. The drumbeat reached as a pulse before it became sound. Carriers moved with training that made weight look ceremonial. The bark rocked with the sure sway of practiced shoulders. Standards flashed in sequence. Ram heads, feathers, and a moon disk caught the sun. The air changed. The village, used to chisels and chalk lines, stood inside a hush that belonged to thresholds. Merit's mother lifted her voice and spoke an opening praise, a few plain lines that call a god to listen. The guard lowered his hand, and the first shard slid into its place beneath the pole. The carriers set their feet. The bark bowed, then rose as if a wind had urged it from the west. The guard nodded. The god would answer. Murmur ran through the crowd and steadied. The second shard was placed with care. Had the ration delay broken any rule? The bark dipped forward again and held longer, as if counting. The guard raised his hand and recited what custom required. The answer was yes. A rule had been bruised. The remedy would be swift, and the oath to deliver grain would be renewed before sunset. The third shard, asking about the door opened by mistake, was set down with both hands. The bark halted. Its weight seemed to settle toward the writing, tilt back, then lean forward again. carriers steadied, eyes on the horizon. At last, the bark inclined toward ascent and remained there as if pointing. The jackal badge on the guard's chest caught light. He spoke so all could hear. A door had been unsealed without clean hands, and a rite was required. The boys who had pried at clay would sweep and carry water, and the threshold would be sealed anew under witness. "What rite?" the foreman asked when the drumbeat allowed speech again. The guard requested a bowl of Nile mud, natron, and a new seal with the jackal standard. A whitened rope would be stretched across the doorway. The boys would stand with heads bare while prayers for forgiveness were said. A lector would read words that close a path and reopen it rightly. Witness would be recorded, and the record would be as heavy as stone. The foreman nodded and sent for rope and bowl, then signaled to the culprits to follow. While the bark rested, families laid other shards beneath the poles. A woman asked for a fever to release her husband. A mason asked that his son's hand grow strong in drawing. The image within linen could not be seen, but the statue inclined with a rhythm that felt like breath. Yes, here. Not yet, there. When the petitions ended, Merritt's mother bowed and stepped forward with the smallest request. She held the unpainted shabti and asked what name it should bear in order to serve rightly when called. The bark tipped once, a faint nod that passed like a ripple through the carriers. The gesture was answer enough. The foreman's careful mouth softened. A name must be a promise spoken from both sides of a door. The jackal sketched on the returned ostracon was not only a warning, it was Wepwawet, opener of the way, the one who goes ahead to make crossings clean. The mother suggested a name that nested promise and path. He who answers at the threshold. Nesamun ruled columns for it, leaving a panel where sacred words would later be spoken by a lector. The carriers lifted, the drumbeats slid away like water, and the lane filled again with work. Work resumed with new gravity. The guard led the walk to the disturbed tomb, the culprits barefoot behind, brooms across their shoulders. The path wound along the base of the cliff, past doorways cut like dark vowels into stone. At the chosen entrance, traces of a broken seal remained. Mud crumbled where curious fingers had pried. The guard set down a coil of rope and a plain bowl. Merritt brought natron and water. Nesamun unfolded a clean strip of linen. The foreman stood aside to witness while swallows stitched the sky. The rite proceeded with economy. The boys swept until dust lay in neat piles. Water washed the lintel and the jambs. Natron whitened the rag that wiped hinges smooth. The lector arrived with a small chest and a voice like sand, smoothed by water. He did not read the famous declarations that proclaim a heart pure. He read shorter lines meant for places, not people, words that bid a passage be shut to wrong and open to right petition. The rope was raised and stretched across the doorway. A new lump of mud took the seal's press. When the final phrase was spoken, the wind ran cool across the cut rock. The guard pressed his palms together and bowed to the stone. The boys carried the sweepings away to scatter beyond sight. The elder workers lingered, as they do when finishing a line that must hold, and laid their hands against the wall before turning back toward the village. In the courtyard, Merritt set the shabti on a plank while Nesamun cut framing lines for the name. He carved only the promise and the place. Ink pooled in shallow grooves and dried to a soft gloss. Between chiseled taps, the mother shared a memory of a letter to the dead written on a small bowl, asking a grandmother to settle a quarrel that had eaten a family's sleep. The bowl had been left at a tomb with bread and beer. The quarrel eased within a week. The foreman listened and nodded. Witness, petition, and reply formed the city's quiet breath. He lifted the cat that had leapt to the plank and set it gently aside, then stood back as the lector unrolled a narrow strip of text for the naming. Toward sunset, the foreman returned with the guard to witness the final stroke. The sky took the color of old honey. Nesamun brushed ink into the ruled panel. He who answers at the threshold. the words darkened and bound to the grain. Merit weighed the figure in her palm as if testing an invisible basket. The guard's jackal badge glinted, and for a moment the small servant and the metal emblem seemed to regard one another across a space shaped by promise. The lector wrapped the figure in linen and lifted it with both hands. Night gathered quickly at the foot of the cliffs. Lamps were lit, then shaded. The village ate and rested. The rite had laid a new stillness on the lanes. In that quiet, the Shabti changed its presence. It no longer felt like an object awaiting instruction. It felt like a word finally set in its sentence. Work would continue at dawn. Paint would take to the grain. Varnish would seal brightness. The lector would speak the charge at the House of Life. But the promise had been set on both sides of a door, and the hills seemed to listen while the river turned once in the moonlight and held its breath. Morning lifted a pearly light from the irrigation canals, and the village walked into it with the measured confidence of people who had done the right thing. Merit set a bowl of water beside the plank where the newly named Shabti waited. The figure's grain held the shine like skin warmed by sun. A lector arrived with a travel chest, greeting foreman and guard with temple courtesy, and asked for quiet as though a door were about to open. The younger sister who first carried the figure stood on tiptoe, then folded her hands. Bread baked in clay ovens, paste for plaster breathed a sour sweetness. Dust hung just above the packed earth, turning light into threads. The day felt as precise as a ruled line, and the small servant stood where east could find its face. They chose the foreman's court for the charge that would bind name to work. Men swept the ground, sprinkled it with water, and chalked a squared line to mark the space. Women stretched linen from pegs to soften the sun. Children watched from thresholds, noses level with the plank. The necropolis guard stood at the edge, helm tucked beneath his arm, jackal badge bright. When the court brightened, the lector set out a cup, 2 cakes, and a folded strip of text. Hori from the House of Life unrolled a neat roll, letters compact as seed. The Shabti faced east on the plank, arms crossed, the little hoe resting along its shoulder, while silence gathered like shade under palms. The lector began with praise that rose and fell like a measured tide. He asked for level fields and true canals, that the servant travel when called and rest when not called. He touched wine to ground and plank, then lifted the figure for a breath so the morning could see its face. Hori read in a plain voice, lines drawn from old chapters for a day of simple duty. The reading invited Wepwawet to clear the way and asked that the promise be heard on both sides of the door. When the last word settled, even the pigeons on the wall went quiet, and the court held its breath as if listening for a footstep. A breeze crossed the court and ink flashed on the palette. A drop fell into the bowl of water and flared outward in the shape of a gatewing opening. The lector leaned and nodded once, smiling without speech, as if the day had agreed rather than argued. Merit steadied the plank. The younger sister held her breath. The ripple faded and shoulders loosened throughout the court. Before the roll was sealed again, a runner came from the necropolis path with a dust, dry message. A chamber near the outer valley had suffered a small fall. No one was hurt, but a painted name lay beneath flaked plaster, partly erased before burial, and now showing through in broken signs. They walked like a careful line along the base of the cliff, past doorways whose lintels kept silent watch. At the chosen entrance, the air felt cooler, as if the earth had drawn a breath and forgotten to return it. Within, a short corridor bent to a chamber where Osiris sat within a painted shrine. Edges had peeled. The peeling had uncovered a cartouche that someone had washed with plaster. The name within had been cut shallow and rubbed, then covered, then revealed again by time. Lamplight moved like water over the scar. While the guard placed a light, the foreman measured with cord and reed rule, and Hori sounded faint signs under his breath. They agreed the change was late and awkward. Someone had wanted a different divine association than permitted, or had feared a quarrel among the living would spill into the west. The erased signs did not belong to a king. They were the private owner's link to a patron god a neighbor had challenged. The foreman told a brief tale of two men who shared a boundary and would not agree about a palm S shade. The guard asked if anyone had written a letter to the dead. Merritt's mother said such letters often quiet a problem that has learned to speak too loudly, especially when bread lines and water rights have already been weighed by tired hands. Hori proposed an order. First, record the wall. Second, ask the god by oracle whether the name should be made whole or left as a warning. Third, keep a watch through the night, not with chains but with attention, to see whether air or dust offers an answer before words are carried. The guard accepted. The foreman added one piece. Set the new servant at the mouth of the chamber. A threshold had asked for a promise. Let the promise meet a threshold, so that a door and a name could test one another without clamor. They placed the shabti where corridor met room, feet aligned with the painted floor pattern. The little hoe rested along the carved shoulder, silent as a closed fist. The lector spoke a single sentence, the same clean line used at the disturbed doorway, then withdrew his voice as one folds a cloth. Outside, lamps and water were set out. Men took turns for the watch. Women kept food nearby and quieted the children who carry unheard answers on their tongues. Inside, lamplight moved like thought over Osiris and the scarred cartouche, while dust hung in the seams and the small servant kept its place without strain. Evening pooled in the valley while lamps were trimmed. Stars rose above the ridge like bead strings, and jackals set a distant boundary of sound. Inside the chamber, the walls smelled of paint and resin. During the second watch, a thin thread of powder slipped from a seam and drew a pale stroke into the light. It landed at the servant's feet and lay like a tiny road no one crossed. The boy pointed without speech. Dawn held steady along the ridge while the watcher boy pointed. A thin line of powder lay at the Shabti-S feet, like a pale rope cast from the wall. The foreman knelt without touching it. Merritt leaned close and saw the dust had fallen in a shallow arc, as if a hidden breath had carried grains through a seam. Hori lowered the lamp. In that gentler light, the fall showed a faintly feathered edge, a quiet echo of the sign for truth on a scale. No one spoke the word. The chamber kept its own air. The guard looked to the threshold, where the small servant stood with folded arms, the little hoe on its shoulder. The lector measured the silence like ink in a cup. The foreman tapped the wall with a cloth-wrapped finger. Most courses answered firm, but the seam above the scar gave a softer reply. They did not cut. The rule held. Record first, ask second, act only when living and dead agreed. Nesamun sketched the fall on an ostracon. Merritt held the lamp. The boy watched, pleased that his pointing had become a mark. When the third watch ended, jackals yielded the ridge to birds. The dust lay where it had fallen, and dawn entered with thin gold. Morning returned the room to care. Outside, women brought water and bread. The guard sent for fresh rope and a seal to renew the boundary after decisions were made. Hori proposed that the oracle be asked at noon. The foreman agreed and dismissed the watch to wash. The Shabti remained at its line, an emblem set to hold a moment until the city could answer. In the village lane, steam rose from ovens and pigment bowls shone on low tables. Merritt's mother hummed as she packed a basket. The younger sister carried linen for tying the petition. Nesamun folded his notes, touched the plank where ink had flashed the day before, and followed the others into heat lifting from stone. By noon, the avenue filled. The bark approached with steps like breathing. The guards slid the first shard beneath the pole. Should the scarred cartouche be restored to its first truth? The bark bowed and held, as if a hand pressed on a shoulder. The guard announced assent. A second shard asked whether the name might be known by the village before plaster was touched. The bark inclined again, slower, then steadied. "Seek the name by record and sign," the guard declared. After the procession passed, Hori led them to the House of Life and unrolled a directory of tombs and plots. The line for the disputed chamber carried a private mark and a short note. A painter called Pauser had once claimed the space, then yielded it after a quarrel to his brother-in-law, a mason named Kai. The entry ended with offerings sent to Hathor's festival, 2 small mirrors and a jar of scented ointment. It was thin proof. They returned to the cliff with water and chalk. In the chamber, the dust still lay like a pale thread. Nesamun copied the directory names onto an ostracon and set it beside the fall. The lector read the brief lines used when 2 claims meet. The foreman tapped again along the seam. Something shifted behind the plaster, a small give that meant an old pocket of air. Merit blew lightly across the feathered dust. It drifted toward Osiris and settled short of the god's footstool. The guard called it a clue. If an offering hand belonged beneath the cartouche, and if a household had argued about patronage, the name might include a god's embrace. Kai of Amun's hand would be ordinary. Kai, who pays Hathor, seemed likely given the mirrors. Hori proposed a test that avoided chisels. A thread dipped in gum could be laid along the seam and lifted to read what plaster kept. Merit prepared a strand fine as hair, steadied her breath, and touched a line of the seam with the sticky cord. The thread lifted specks too small to read. On the plank outside, Nesamun pressed them into a smear and wet it with a single drop of water. Pigment rose, dull red and stubborn black. He laid the smear beside a village tablet where common names and god signs practiced their marriages. The smear read like a memory, the curve of an arm, the wedge that begins a feather, the ending of a basket. The lector smiled. The foreman let out a thin breath he had not noticed holding. They could not yet speak the owner with certainty, but the pattern suggested a formula binding a private name to a goddess of thresholds and welcome. Hathor of the West guards the pass into the necropolis and greets the dead as a cow emerging from the mountain. A mirror as a gift made sense. Merit murmured a combing song that praised the Lady of Turquoise who hears at doorways at dusk. They agreed upon the path. The cartouche would be conserved rather than recut. Loose flakes would be fastened with glue made from fish and plant. Missing lines would be drawn faintly in red, so truth and repair could both be seen. The name itself would be sought through further record, not invention. The Shabti would remain at the threshold until the work was finished, bearing witness as a worker bears a basket. The guard set his badge on a stone and helped lift a plank, while Hori read a brief blessing to Hathor of the West. The first flake lifted at the edge near the feathered dust. Merit touched adhesive with a reed and pressed the plaster gentle as if smoothing a childish brow. Nesamun marked his record and counted each repair. The foreman watched shadow creep toward the wall. The Shabti did not move, but as light thinned, a beetle drifted toward the corridor. It reached the painted floor line, paused as if discouraged, and turned away. The boy grinned at the small order of things. Evening folded itself along the ridge. Swallows tilted and were replaced by bats. The boys who had pried the earlier seal carried water and were careful with their feet. Merit mixed a second pot until it gleamed like thin honey and gave off a faint, clean scent. Hori checked the rope and seal at the door and noted them for the record. The guard paced once between threshold and corner, then stood at ease with his helm under his arm and his jackal badge quiet in the last light. When the lamp wicks were snuffed, the chamber held a new stillness. The cartouche rested with edges sealed and gaps mapped in red. Outside, the rope lay slack around the door until morning renewed it. The day had drawn a line between haste and care. In the quiet, the small servant waited at the threshold like a word with its meaning near at hand. Night rose along the ridge like a careful tide, and the watchers set the morrow's work. The guard would ride to the overseer and report the oracle, ascent, and the state of the wall. Hori would search the House of Life for inventories that might pair Kai's name with a patron or record a vow kept with mirrors. Merit would prepare tracing boards, fresh glue, and a small supply of fine plaster to shore edges that might lift when heat returned. Nesamun would copy the ostraka with clean hands and bring a jar for powder, so every mark of the seam could be kept like a witness. The foreman would fix the watch in pairs until sunrise and keep children from the door with the brisk tone used when a line must hold. Once the tasks were named, the village let its breath lengthen. A wind moved faintly through the cut and left the smell of resin and chalk. Far off, a dog barked and fell silent. Nearby, a beetle returned to the painted floor, felt the hard edge, and chose the cooler shadow of the corridor. Nothing further required judgment. The door owned its promise, the servant kept its place, and the names that would make tomorrow's work lawful hovered like birds that know the path to water. The stars deepened. Sun lifted pale light from the cliffs and laid it across the village roofs. Work started with calm speed. The guard rode to the overseer at the fields. Hori went to the House of Life. Merit ground plaster in the foreman's court and strained it through linen. Nesamun recopied the night's notes while the younger sister fetched water and cloth. The cartouche room kept its watch under a cord of sunlight. He who answers at the threshold stood where corridor met chamber, a modest promise shaped in wood and ink. 2 quarry boys crept close to stare and were sent to carry water. By the second hour, the new glue had dulled to match its neighbors, and the red mapping dried to a rose shadow that could guide another hand. In the temple library, Hori drew out baskets of ostraka. Mason ledgers showed crews by month. Kai's name stood beside marks for stone brought and stone laid. A separate shard tallied offerings for the Lady of the West at the turn of Shemu. 2 mirrors, 1 jar of unguent, a 4-toothed comb. A note explained a vow fulfilled after a quarrel set aside. The names Pauser and Kai were written together as if peace had finally learned a line. A brittle papyrus held a draft of a property exchange. It named the painter as first claimant, the mason as second, and promised the chamber to Kai upon delivery of tools and dressed stone. A witness list followed in tight script. The date sat within a rain whose praenomen still brightens pylons. Nothing contradicted the oracle's assent to careful repair and honest record. Grain boats slid into the city at midday, sails like white wings. The ration delay ended as promised. Women stood with baskets, men signed tallies with pride. The overseer sealed a decree that restored the schedule for oil and barley. Rumor softened into relief. At the cliff, the foreman welcomed Hori's findings. The guard read the property draft aloud, voice level as a plumb line. An old neighbor said he remembered the comb of boxwood and the mirror pair wrapped in linen as if they were water. Merit weighed the memory against the ledger, then returned to the wall. New adhesive sat ready, pale as milk. Flakes near the feather sign took the glue and settled. Afternoon leaned hard on the rock. The small servant kept the doorway while swallows kicked light from their wings. Nesamun spooned a pinch of powder into a jar whenever dust fretted from the seam. The boy watcher counted in sets of 60. The foreman checked the floor grid and found it true. The guard tested the rope and sat where 1 turn of the head covered threshold and corner. As the sun lowered, a woman named Hena arrived with a shallow bowl. Its inside bore a neat red inscription to a grandchild gone too soon. She set the bowl on a stone and asked to leave bread and beer for the household that once claimed this chamber. The foreman agreed, and Hori spoke a brief blessing for the Lady of the West, whose horns hold the disc that lights even narrow halls. Hena bowed to the rope and went away lighter. Near sunset, a thin cobra slid from a crack in the outer wall and tasted the air. The boy froze. The guard rose but did not draw blade. The snake reached the threshold, met the Shabti's tiny hoe, paused in a single loop, and turned back to the warm stones it knew. An older mason whispered that good thresholds teach manners. Shoulders eased. When shadows pooled, the last flakes were set and the red mapping stood clean. Merit washed her hands and laid the brush to rest. Hori sealed the copies of the records with a drop of wax. The foreman called the day's witness list, and each name answered. Boys carried ladders away, women folded the awning, the rope was retied, the seal pressed, the watch assigned. Night rose with a long coolness. Stars gathered like seeds in a net. From the East Temple, singers began a hymn for the evening bark of the moon. The village answered with lower notes. The small servant stood in its square of dark, the promise in its legs no louder than a breath. Lamps were trimmed low, crickets stitched the silence, and the wall breathed steadily. Past midnight, the seam above the cartouche let go a faint sigh and stilled. No fresh powder fell. The jar kept its thin lining, and the boys' counts slid into sleep. Toward dawn, a breeze brought the smell of wet earth from canals refilling after the day's draw. The rope held, the seal held, the wall held. At first light, the guard woke the foreman and Hori. The chamber looked ordinary in a way that felt earned. The cartouche lay clear where it had been hidden and marred, the repairs visible, the gaps mapped, but not lied over. Hori set the copies in a niche. The foreman touched the stone with the back of his fingers and nodded. The plan shifted. The oracle would not be asked again. Record would carry the rest. A painter would lay a faint guide in red to show where the lost strokes would have turned. When the guide dried, a transparent coat would fix past and present in one lawful surface. The Shabti would return to the village only after the last witness set a name beside the guard's seal. Until then, it would answer at the threshold, a small worker whose task was attention. Workmen stepped into the light, shoulders squared. The ridge brightened like old honey. The village breathed as a single house. A door had been taught its promise. A name had found its path. The story that had come by night boat moved in daylight with the steady grace of something that belonged. It belonged here. Morning settled into fine work. The painter came with chalked string and a pot of red ochre. He greeted the foreman, touched the rope at the door, and entered with his kit held in both hands so nothing struck the painted grid. He studied the scarred cartouche like a surveyor studying a bank after winter. When his breath steadied, he drew thin red guides that echoed the ghost strokes, sleeping beneath the repairs. Hori stood by the niche and read the ledger copies again. The draft naming Kai carried witnesses proud to be remembered. Nesamun rewrote the list with fresh ink so village and temple records would match. The guard checked the seal where rope met mud and pressed the jackal again. Merit stabilized a border of cornflowers cracked by heat. Her hands moved without hurry. The younger sister held the glue shell and watched brush and breath make small flakes accept peace. The boy counted 60 heartbeats at the entrance, while he who answers at the threshold faced him like a polite colleague. By mid-morning, a visitor from the northern slope brought a report. A tomb down the wadi had given off a dry clatter like gravel shaken once. The seal looked sound. No powder lay by the jam. A bat might have turned or air settled behind a slab. The guard marked the place for a later circuit. The news moved through the rooms like a drum that makes feet listen to their weight. Such reports were tied on small shards at the guardhouse door. At noon, the painter snapped a line and a straight red whisper hung over the wall. He stepped back and nodded, satisfied the feather's curve would meet the balance. Hori smiled. The foreman raised a small sign of approval. A modest coat would later lock red and stone together so past and present could sit without argument. Near the heat's peak, a potter brought a bowl wrapped in linen. On its rim, a letter to the dead asked an aunt to mend a quarrel about a storage room and promised a mirror at Hathor's feast. Merit's mother read the lines aloud, firm, respectful, clear about bread and measure. Hori copied the wording for the archive that guides petitioners. The potter left the bowl with the guard as witness to the promise. Work paused in the hottest hour. People rested in the wall's shade. The guard shared dates. The boy taught the younger sister to count swallows to time a lamp wick. Nesamun sharpened his reed and cleaned the palette for the small panel on the Shabti's legs. Later, Hori visited the House of Life and found a hymn to the Lady of the Sycamore, who greets the justified at the western door. The lines named mirrors, ointment, and safe crossing. He copied it and returned by the ridge path. The hymn would accompany the final coat and bless the figure. It asked for shade, for cool water, and for an easy crossing when names are called. At dusk, women carried sistra to the small shrine for Hathor of the west near the mouth of the valley. A brief rite marked rations restored and the boundary dispute stilled. Mirrors caught the last daylight and threw it gently across faces. The foreman counted workers like a gardener, counts trees after wind, and his shoulders dropped when all were present. Merritt's mother sang, and the village answered as if the song rose from the limestone and returned softened by breath. An older woman pointed to painted cows emerging from the mountain with the disc between their horns. She recalled a season when names were miscut and the village could not sleep. No famine, no fever, only wrong names rubbing words raw. Time, witness, and patient hands cured it. The warning fit the day like a well-made lid. Twilight drew blue over the ridge. The guard led a small circuit to the northern report. The door looked ordinary, the rope tight, the seal clean. He listened. Only a bat spoke, its small cry like a dropped bead. The group stood until their ears agreed nothing asked for human voices. They returned with the moon, guiding their steps between shadows. Back in the chamber, the painter capped the pot and washed his hands. Hori set the hymn in the niche with the witnesses. The foreman laid the board so each hand could sign in order. Merritt checked the repairs with a lamp held low, and the boy smiled when the light found no loose thread. When stars patterned the cliffline, the lector returned with a compact bundle. He spoke the short charge that seals a joined task, ancient wall and present hand, and asked that the small servant keep the door with the patience of those who carved it. He lifted the figure to share the moon's gaze, then set it back in its square. He sprinkled a pinch of natron on the threshold so the mouth of the place would keep a clean taste. The village slept early. The watch changed at the gate. Night ran clear and dry. In the hour before dawn, a breeze carried the faint smell of desert thyme down the wadi and left it at thresholds like a good wish for the valley. Morning would bring the coat that fixes guide to wall. After that, the chamber would rejoin the stillness it had earned. The figure would come home to the village. The next petition would find the bark. The work of naming, sealing, and teaching doors to keep their promises would continue with the calm confidence now living in the lanes. The story turned forward without hurry, knowing each threshold owns a pace and each name asks to be carried on a steady breath. Teachers rehearsed children to speak the word for truth and weigh it with a palm feather. Morning brought the promised coat. The painter prepared a clear solution and tested it on a scrap. When the surface accepted a modest gloss, he showed the foreman and Hori. Both approved. The guard lifted the rope just high enough for careful steps. The red guides looked calm in the light. The painter dipped a soft brush, spread a thin film across the repaired cartouche, and watched the wall drink it. Merritt held a lamp so floors would show. Nesimoon noted each patch and counted strokes. The boy learned the word for a layer that quiets a join. The younger sister kept flies away with a palm fan. Hori read a hymn to the Lady of the Sycamore while the brush moved. The lines asked for shade at noon and for sweet water at evening. When the bowl showed the bottom, the painter thinned the last of the solution and sealed the edge. The coat dried to a gentle sheen. The red remained visible beneath, steady as a promise. The foreman checked the grid and found it true. The guard pressed the jackal into a pellet of mud and set it beside the witness list. The rope dropped back to its hook. The chamber felt finished. Work ended with ordered gestures. Tools were wiped, brushes tied, lamps pinched. Merritt lifted he who answers at the threshold and set the figure on a linen square. The lector wrapped the servant as one wraps a small loaf, laid it in a shallow basket, and asked that the village walk it home with the calm a door deserves. The procession took the low path, small and quiet. Women slid sprigs of thyme into the basket's weave. The younger sister kept both hands steady on the rim. Hori carried the hymn and copy of the witness list. The guard walked behind with helm under his arm. The foreman did not speak. At the foreman's court, the basket rested on the plank. The lector opened the wrap and faced the servant east. Hori read the brief charge that binds a tool to attention. Nesamun filled the small panel on the legs with the framed promise. He who answers at the threshold stood now with name and lines firm. Merritt pressed a fingertip to the ink and smiled when it dried without shine. Neighbors looked and kept their voices low. An old man who had repaired door lintels for 40 seasons weighed the figure like a tool. He nodded and set it back. The mother who dreamed the first message poured a little beer for Wepwawet and for the Lady of the West. The younger sister left a crumb of bread for the road to whatever threshold might call next. Hori proposed a rest for the servant in the House of Life before new work. A day in the library would let 2 lectors speak the longer charge and set a copy of the panel S-words in the archive. The foreman agreed. The guard signed the move. Merritt wrapped the figure again. At noon, a messenger from the East Bank arrived with a tablet from the temple store. It recorded ration oath renewed and oil schedule restored. The tablet bore the overseer S. seal and a line of thanks to those who had watched with care. The court breathed out. The strike story elders kept Felt farther away. After rest and bread, the small group crossed the ferry. The basket rode on Hori's lap. The current ran full with the season's gift. Children waved from the bank and guessed at the basket, then forgot and chased one another. The House of Life received the figure with restraint. The chief lector examined the panel, traced the name with a nail, and asked who had carved the grain so even. Merritt answered and accepted his nod. 2 lectors stood at the threshold to the room of spells and spoke a longer charge in alternating voices. The words named baskets, ropes, ferry poles, and the small duties that hold a city steady. In a quiet room, the figure rested while the copyist set down the panel's lines. Nesamun wrote with care and left a space for a miniature drawing. The chief lector added a short note about the repaired cartouche and placed the record among lists sent when work and promise join. Late in the day, a tremor of news crossed the courtyard. The guard house had received 2 reports from beyond the northern ridge. One spoke of a stone fallen in an unused shaft with no harm done. The other spoke of a fox slipping into a low tomb and leaving prints across ash. The chief lector listened and said that rains in distant places sometimes teach slopes to shift. He directed that the jackal patrol walk the ridge at dusk and put eyes on each rope. They crossed back at last light. On the western bank, the lanes smelled of bread and plaster. The servant returned to the foreman's court. Merritt set it on the plank with east to the yard. The younger sister placed a lamp near its feet, a small shore of light. Evening gathered with ordinary sounds. A pot came from a hearth. A jar knocked and was righted. A child recited signs to a patient cat. The guard passed the gate and greeted the watch. Hori copied the day's entries and rolled them neat. The mother hummed. The foreman sat with his back to the wall and let quiet find him. When stars rose, the lector returned for a final word. He thanked the house for its watch and asked that any dream sent to the lane be sent with plain meaning. The village slept. The figure stood within its square like a thought put where it can be found. In a far wadi, a fox trotted across dust and left signs that would be gone by noon. The ridge breathed. The river turned once and hushed. The season held. Night kept its measure. Dawn loosened the village from sleep. The foreman stepped into the court and found the small servant on its linen square, east to the yard. Merritt brought a basin and rinsed her hands. Hori arrived with yesterday's copy and a folded hymn. The guard paused at the gate to exchange signs with the watch. The patrol from the ridge reached the lane before breakfast. Their leader reported in the quiet tone used when news is more odd than urgent. 2 marks only. The unused shaft had shed a little more gravel onto its lip, and the fox prints that crossed ash at a low tomb now threaded back out again, with a second set atop the first. The ash smelled faintly of fresh resin. Resin meant someone had burned incense recently, perhaps a petitioner leaving a letter to the dead. That was lawful. But the foreman lifted a brow at doubled prints. Hori suggested courtesy before inquiry. The guard nodded. He would walk the path with 2 elders, ask neighbors, and leave a small dish in case anyone wished to speak by offering. Before they left, a midwife ran into the court with her shawl askew. A first child had chosen this morning to come. She needed rope and clean water, and if the house agreed, the little servant to stand by the door. Thresholds were busy places. On this, one breath would cross into names. The foreman looked to Merit. Merit looked to the figure. A worker made for crossings could keep company with a berth. The guard agreed. Hori folded the hymn for shade and blessing. They followed the midwife into a lane cooled by wet sweepings. At the house, the mother labored in a room trimmed with blue border and painted papyrus. Women moved like good tools. Merit set the servant by the threshold, east to the rising day. The younger sister fanned the mother S. brow and counted breaths with the boy S. steady 60. Between contractions, the midwife asked Hori to speak the line that invites the moon S. child to find his path. He spoke it plainly, as one teaches letters. The guard waited in the courtyard, listening to water and voices. Nesamun made a brief record, because a birth deserves witness as much as repair. Near noon, the child came with a strong cry. Merit's mother placed a pinch of natron at the threshold for a clean taste and laughed when the cry grew. The small servant, face to the light, stood as steady as any older brother. When the courtyard quieted, a mason named Hanenu asked the guard to step aside. He spoke haltingly. The incense at the low tomb had been his doing. He had placed a bowl with a letter inside his brother's niche without first calling witness. The fox must have been there before and after. He had meant no harm, only haste. Quarrels about a boundary had woken again, and grief had turned his feet too quickly. The guard listened without hardening his face. Hori returned from the threshold and heard the rest. The remedy was simple. The same hands would reseal the small niche under witness. The letter would stay where it was. A few words would be said to teach the door how to hold both grief and order. Hanenu bowed. The foreman added that the boundary would be walked at twilight by both families, 2 measurers and a cord. They ate in the cool of a shade wall, sharing dates and bread. Hori sent a boy for the hymn to the Lady of the Sycamore, so the child, Is first evening, would have shade in its words. The younger sister carried the servant back to the foreman's court with both hands around the basket, as if it held an egg. In the later heat, the guard took 2 elders to the unused shaft. Small stones had indeed fallen like a single cough from the lip. The rope sat firm, the seal true. A breath of cooler air rose from within, then stilled. The guard left a little bowl at the edge, half full of water, and wrote the report on a shard. Air moves. Rock forgets. All remained in measure. Toward sunset, the group walked to the low tomb. Hanenu brought his bowl. The fox prints had already blurred under day wind. The niche accepted a neat patch of clay and the press of the jackal. Hori spoke the short line about doors, remembering duty to both sides. The small gathering returned with easy steps. That evening, a thin festival knitted lanes and courtyards together. Paper boats and reed skiffs floated on irrigation channels, carrying crumbs and the names of grandparents toward the river. Elders hummed the slow tune that steers small lights. It was the Wag month, when remembrance travels by water and the living tidy the path to the west. Merit set the servant on the plank and faced it east again. Nesamun added the birth to his tablet and tucked it into a jar with other quiet minutes the city should never lose. The foreman oiled a hinge and smiled when it stopped complaining. The guard walked the ridge and waved to a distant jackal. Night sharpened, stars pricked the mountain line. In the silent hour, a brief pulse rolled from somewhere past the northern slope, like a shrug moving through stone. No rope slipped, no seal cracked. A small shower of sand whispered in the unused shaft and ended. The village slept on. The ridge listened. At false dawn, a breeze carried kitchen smoke low and blue. The court stirred. The servant stood where it had been placed, name quiet and sure. The child woke hungry and warm. The letter lay safe in its niche, grief learning to sit beside order. The fox trotted along the wadi and found no mischief to claim. The story carried its weight easily, each part held by hands and by names, ready for whatever the next threshold might ask. The day turned bright and precise. The wagboats had long since drifted toward the river, and the village returned to measured tasks. The guard met the foreman at the gate and reviewed the ridge notes. Nothing urgent showed, only air in a shaft and a fox where ash still held scent. Hori arrived with a hymn for crossings. Merit set out boards for a plaster mix, while the younger sister sorted brushes by size. Nesamun spread his tablets and copied the child's name into the day list. The mother rested while neighbors carried water and bread. The small servant stood on its linen square at the foreman escort and looked east with the modest confidence of finished work awaiting a next call. Near mid-morning, a boat from the east bank touched at the ferry. On the deck lay a bier, wrapped in clean linen. A family had come to carry an elder to his house in the west. The priest with them asked whether the artisan's village might lend careful hands to steady the bier through the wadi. The path beyond the ridge twisted, and the family wished to arrive with calm hearts. The foreman agreed. Crossings deserve helpers. He chose 2 masons with sure footing, the boy who could count a lamp wick without losing the measure, and Merit to guide the pace. Hori folded the hymn. The guard joined to clear any crowd near the cliff. The bier would pass the lane with a brief stop for water and a prayer at the little shrine of the Lady of the West. When the crew reached the court, the younger sister set a jar on a low stool and touched the rim so the water would remember stillness. The priest lifted his hands for a simple blessing and named the elder as one who kept scales fair. The family's faces softened. The village looked like a palm offering shade. The procession moved with rhythm. The bier rested at the shrine. Mirrors caught sun at the doorway. Merit set the pace along the base of the ridge, where the path learns to narrow and to turn. The boy counted in 60s and nodded to the guard at each bend. A heron lifted from a canal and crossed the sky. Hori kept the hymn ready for the moment the west opened. Near the first turning, a faint shiver moved through the slope, like grain settling in a jar. Stones clicked in the unused shaft and went still. The guard judged the line and kept the company moving. Dust settled. The bier passed the place without a jar. The boy reset his measure. At the mouth of the valley, the priest paused and looked to Merit. Would the house lend one more courtesy? He wished that a true threshold companion might stand at the tomb mouth when the elder was set within. Merit looked to the foreman. The small servant had been made for crossings and doors. The house agreed. A runner with a light step returned to the court. The younger sister received the request and lifted the basket with both hands. Nesamun placed a copy of the panel's words beside the figure. The basket moved through the lane at a steady walk, the runner careful not to show haste. When she reached the procession, the priest smiled with relief. The valley accepted them with clean air that smelled of stone. At the chosen door, the family stood in a half circle. The priest touched Natron to the lintel. The guard checked the rope already prepared. The mason set the bier down with sure hands. Hori offered the hymn, and the priest nodded. He asked Merit to set the small servant where light from the entrance would fall on its face. The hymn moved like water. It named shade under a sycamore and the taste of cool drink after heat. It asked that doors remember courtesy and that ferries find balance. The family wept with gratitude that sounded like relief. When the words ended, the priest turned to the figure. He spoke gently, as one instructs a co-worker. He asked the little servant to attend here until the mourning was finished and the door learned the shape of their names. He touched the carved hoe with a fingertip and let his hand fall. The valley wind moved once and quieted. Dust did not rise. The basket felt lighter without the figure. The boy counted a final 60. They sealed the door under the jackal sign while the family watched. The rope took the knot. The seal pressed clean. The priest poured a measure of water against the lintel and bowed. The guard stepped back. Merritt breathed out the careful breath that follows a hard line drawn straight. The masons lifted the empty bier. The procession returned at an easy pace. On the walk home, Hori spoke about thresholds the way a teacher speaks about numbers. He said good doors make a city strong. He said names carry weight and must be set where they fit. He said small servants can help a house remember chores as much as a wall remembers paint. Evening found the village busy with ordinary things that felt richer because the day had gone well. The mother nursed her child under a reed shade. Hinenu measured the boundary with his neighbor and laughed at a palm that leans at noon. The foreman oiled one more hinge. The guard wrote his circuit in neat hand. The river turned glassy as birds dipped their wings at the margins of light. In the last hour, the ridge gave one more small shrug. No stone fell. The unused shaft kept its breath. The fox left no prints on ash. The figure stood in the valley and faced east through a door that had learned its promise. The village rested with that knowledge like a well-folded cloth. Names were holding, doors were listening. The season moved with a steady hand. Dawn arrived as a soft brightness that slipped between walls. The foreman counted crews at the gate and marked a slate. Merritt soaked linen for sifters and set her bowls where the shade would turn with the sun. The younger sister practiced the measured sweep that keeps dust low. At the valley mouth, the family of the elder continued their vigil. A son brushed footprints from the threshold, so the last prints would belong to those with the right to cross. The servant faced east. The priest refreshed a cup of water and a dish of figs. Light slid down the jam with the quiet pace of a sundial. A messenger arrived from the north with a cloth-wrapped shard. He came from an overseer of channels repairing a break near the desert's edge. The overseer had found a narrow plaque of wood sealed in mud beside a levee, painted with a doorway and a single feather, and asked whether the House of Life would study it. Hori touched the feather thoughtfully and agreed to carry it across. Before he left, an old woman from the potter's quarter asked for words to guide a letter to the dead. She wished to speak to a sister who loved order, yet had left a shelf untidy in the minds of those who remained. Hori offered a simple formula. Set bread and beer before the niche. Speak the name. Ask for peace on the shelf and clarity in the hands that sought it. Promise a small mirror at Hathor's feast and keep the promise quickly. Work held its rhythm. The boy and the younger sister carried water to men fixing a lintel. Nesamun copied yesterday's witness list with steady care that made other hands trust the scroll. Merritt repaired a painted cornflower at the edge of a false door. The foreman tested the new hinge and listened with satisfaction to a silence where a squeal had been. At midday, the valley priest returned for bread while the family rested. He paused at the court to thank the house for lending the small companion. He placed a cone of perfumed fat on the hearth for any singer who might need a clear voice later. Hori crossed the river with the shard and the plaque. In the House of Life, he set them on a cedar board and opened a drawer of small texts. The feather with the doorway recalled titles used for gates and for the weighing room. He found a hymn that joined Ma'at to a threshold by speaking of shade and measure. The plaque, cleaned of mud, showed a doorway with a tiny hand at the lintel, an old sign of greeting sometimes painted on storeroom doors. On his way back, he met a fisher who complained of crocodiles heavy in a side channel. The fisher had left an offering at Sobek's small shrine near the ferry and asked for calmer water. Hori made a note for the guard to walk that bank at dusk. Late in the afternoon, a shout rose from the northern path, clear rather than afraid. Men from the ridge waved to the guard and pointed to the unused shaft. A slab inside had eased an arm's length and come to rest against a step, closing a pocket where air had moved. No one had been within, and no rope had been touched. The guard looked down and saw the slab leaning like a door half shut. He marked the mouth with white chalk and tied a fresh knot in the rope. He returned and recommended a rite of thanks for escapes that happen before danger asks for names. The foreman agreed. At twilight, the village gathered at the little Hathor shrine. Mirrors lifted the last light. Bread and beer set the tone. Merritt's mother sang a brief song that combs worry smooth. Hori read the hymn that ties Mahat to a door. The guard named the shaft and the avoided harm. A coolness moved through the lane. After the hymn, the potter's old woman brought her letter in a bowl. She read it to the niche at the shrine's side. The words were plain and steady. She acknowledged an untidy shelf and asked that those living remember to order it without hard feeling. She placed the bowl beneath the little cow that steps from the mountain and promised a mirror at the next feast. The village murmured approval. When lamps were lit, a neighbor from the northern slope arrived with a report. At the edge of evening, the unused shaft had given a gust that rang against a jar left empty on the stones. The jar answered with a low tone that seemed to say, "Hold." He removed the jar, covered it, and came to tell the guard. The guard smiled at the sound a good door makes when it teaches patience and wrote the line on a shard. Night was dry and clear. Stars patterned the ridge. The family returned to their vigil, and the priest resumed his quiet talk with the door. He told the small servant that its posture taught people to stand upright with less effort. In the village, the younger sister slept with her hands folded like the Shabtis. The boy dreamed numbers climbing a stair and pausing on a landing made of light. Toward midnight, the river flattened to a sheet of darkness. Far out, a crocodile turned without malice and sank again, as if the fisher's offering had cooled a temper. Near the unused shaft, a fox paused and listened, then took a different path, learning the village's habits without trouble. Before dawn, Hori returned with the plaque and set it on the foreman's bench. He would speak with the overseer when the sun made the hieroglyphs eager to be seen. The feather would stand for honest measure. The doorway would remind hands to greet a threshold before they enter. With the first birdsong, the day resumed its careful count. Another day widened into measured brightness. The plaque with a doorway and a feather lay on the foreman's bench, where Hori had set it before dawn. The wood had dried to a soft luster. The painted feather rested above the lintel like a breath that teaches balance. The overseer of channels arrived at first light, dusty from the levee road, and bowed with the gratitude of someone whose work runs straight when signs point true. He asked whether the mark might be copied for storerooms where grain and tools learn to behave. The foreman agreed. Thresholds behave when greeted. Hori selected a narrow board and copied the doorway with a sure brush. Merritt supplied a trace of chalk for the feather's curve. Nesamun wrote a single line beneath, "Measure here." The overseer promised to hang the board at a sluice, then carry the pattern to granaries along the canal. In the lane, the younger sister counted heartbeats while water darkened, swept dust. The boy practiced tying the neat knot used to anchor a rope without biting a post. The guard inspected the ridge path and noted that fox prints had thinned with the change of wind. He returned by the small shrine and found the potter's mirror waiting beneath Hathor and cow, promise kept. At the valley mouth, the family's vigil entered its last morning. The priest set a small cone of scented fat so the room would remember kindness when it was sealed. He thanked the village messenger who carried water at midday and the masons who steadied the beer. He spoke to the servant with the courtesy given to co-workers. When the sun reached the jam's middle mark, the family gathered and touched the door with gentle palms. The guard pressed the jackal seal. The rope took its final knot. The priest poured a measure of water against the lintel and bowed to the west. Merritt lifted the figure with both hands and turned its face east. The valley wind moved once and settled. The procession home was quiet and short. In the foreman's court, the servant stood again on its linen square. Hori read a brief thanksgiving and set the witness list beside the basket. Neighbors passed, glanced, and lowered their voices as people do when a house has fulfilled a promise. Midday brought a grain-keeper whose store had begun to speak at dusk, a hollow thud as doors settled, and clay bins answered like drums. He asked whether the plaque's sign might quiet the speech. The foreman smiled. Doors love instruction. He sent Merritt and the boy with a chalked board and the right knot. Hori provided a short formula. Speak the name of balance. Greet the lintel. Leave a fingertip of oil on the hinge. Measure the pile before and after evening. They found the storehouse warm and orderly. Merritt hung the copied sign above the entry. The boy set the knot and lifted a bucket to learn the door's new temper. The wood replied with a single orderly creak, as if satisfied to be reminded of its duty. Later, when the sun slid low, the grain-keeper reported that the drums were quiet and the bins breathed without fuss. In the afternoon, the mother of the child asked about a naming day. The priest from the valley offered a small rite at the shrine of the Lady of the Sycamore, where shade falls just so at late light. A bowl of water would reflect the leaf pattern and fix it as a sign of protection. The foreman set the hour. Neighbors were invited to bring short, useful wishes instead of long speeches. Before the rite, Hori returned to the House of Life and looked again at the doorway plaque. He found a short hymn that binds Ma'at to simple tasks, grain by basket and water by breath, held between canal and jar. He copied it for the child. Nesamun wrote the birth in the roll that tracks quiet joys. Toward evening, the naming gathered under the sycamore. Mirrors caught the last light and gave it to the bowl. The priest traced a circle on the water with a reed and spoke the child E.S. name, so it would enter the pattern like a fish entering shade. Merritt set the small servant on the step. The boy counted the hymn's lines. The younger sister held the bowl steady. Neighbors offered wishes shaped like tools. A mason wished for true lines. A potter wished for vessels that do not argue with heat. The guard wished for paths that show their edges in dust. Hori wished for words that sit level when the day leans. The foreman wished for hinges that remember to be quiet. The mother wished for sleep that returns quickly. When the hymn ended, the foreman touched the child, palm, with a grain of salt so speech would keep good edges. The mother lifted the baby toward the leaves. Shimmer moved across the bowl and steadied as if the water had agreed. People breathed easier. The rite ended with bread, and a sip of beer passed with quiet good humor. Night brought a breeze from the river. The ridge lay like a sleeping ox against the stars. The unused shaft held its new stillness. The small servant rested in the court with face east and name sure. In the guardhouse, the shards of recent days stood in a row, each line a small weight holding order to earth. Hori placed the copied hymn with the doorway sign and smiled at a sluice that would read, "Measure here to anyone who forgot." Just before dawn, a patrolman paused at the north path and listened. The slope answered with the comfort of stone that remembers its own weight. A heron lifted from the canal with measured patience. Morning would open with ordinary work, and ordinary work felt like a festival when names and doors held. The story moved forward with the strength of calm hands again. Morning unfolded with the quiet assurance of work that knows its tools. The plaque with a doorway and a feather hung above the foreman's bench, its modest command to measure here, steadying hurried hands. Crews gathered under a sky rinsed clean by night wind. The guard read shard notes and tied them to his belt. Hori checked the hymn for doors. Merritt set out bowls and sieves. The younger sister sorted linen strips. The boy counted brushes and settled dust with water. An overseer from the canal arrived with breath quickened by distance. He bowed and spoke without dramatics. The river had swelled a finger past its mark at the levee where the first plaque was found. The sluice behaved, yet water pressed every seam. He asked for hands that could carry order to a bank the way a straight line carries order across a wall. The foreman called names like a gardener naming shade. 2 masons for bracing, a carpenter for pegs, Merritt for plaster, the guard for watch and rope, Hori for clear words, and 2 quick youths for carrying. They walked the canal path past fields of new shoots. At the levee, the river showed its shoulder just below the top. Not danger, yet not leisure. The copied doorway sign already hung at the sluice. It reminded hands to greet the lintel and measure before lifting. The carpenter set pegs where boards met. The masons tapped soft places and chalked them true. Merritt mixed a skim of clay and chopped straw to seat into seams like a calm breath. Work moved with many hands but one mind. Silt bags were tied and set where water nosed at gaps. Pegs held boards. Rope steadied feet on slick clay. When the river pressed harder, teams matched the push with one more layer. When it eased, they checked what held and trimmed the edge smooth. The boy counted sets, so each task returned in turn. Nesamun wrote a clean list of measures and places strengthened for the next crew. Mid-morning brought a test. A seam near the sluice darkened and began to drink. Merritt pressed paste with a reed, and then with the heel of her hand. The guard called for the harness. 2 men leaned into the rope, while the carpenter drove a peg. The seam brightened and stilled. Hori traced the feather on the plaque, and the overseer laughed at himself for forgetting to breathe. By noon, the bank looked like a line that will hold. The foreman listened for the sound mud makes when it agrees. A low yes from a plan that fits. The guard marked the place with white chalk for the evening watch. The boy counted 60 in the shade. The younger sister cooled wrists and necks and smiled at the settled edge. They returned by the ferry while the sun rang on the river. A boat with a painted eye touched shore. 2 officials stepped down, linen fresh, voices formal. They carried a sealed tablet from the vizier's office. The order asked for an inventory walk of certain tombs in the outer valley. A rumor of missing jars had crossed a palace courtyard. The inspection would be courteous and swift. The artisan's village was requested to provide guides, witnesses, and clean hands. The foreman read the tablet twice and nodded. Witness prevents shadows from learning to speak. Hori named the short text used when doors open under order. The guard requested the route in writing. The officials produced a list, names known, houses known. None of the chambers were royal, yet the valley dislikes strangers without notice. The foreman asked that the walk wait until morning so proper hands could be called and a priest found. The officials agreed. In the court, bread and onions were set without talk. The officials admired the small servant standing on its linen square. They asked whether it was a token or a tool. Hori answered that it was both, and that small servants teach larger doors to behave. Nesamun copied the route, then added a column for witnesses and a column for seals. The younger sister polished the copper bowl used for water at thresholds. The boy prepared reed wicks and counted them twice. Evening brought a meeting at the shrine of the Lady of the West. Word of the inspection moved like a measured ripple through lanes. No one feared insult, yet care gathered as easily as dust. The priest accepted the role of steadying voice. He would carry natron, a small cone of fat, and the hymn that ties ma'at to a door. Families whose tombs were named sent elders to stand as eyes. The guard chose a route that would make footsteps predictable. The foreman assigned pairs to each doorway, so every seal would be witnessed twice. When lamps were lit, quiet returned with a little edge. Children were coached to keep to inner courtyards at first light. Tools were laid out as if for a lesson. Merritt cut a fresh wedge for testing plaster at seams. The carpenter wrapped pegs with linen so they would not knock in sacred rooms. Horry rolled the hymns with deliberate hands. The small servant faced east and waited where dawn would find its face. Night held. Stars made their patient ledger above the ridge. A jackal trotted the path and paused, then moved on without teaching alarm. The levee kept its new line. The village slept while the officials murmured by lamplight over their list with the satisfaction of men who enjoy a clean table. Before dawn, the foreman walked the gate and felt the cool stone. He greeted the doorway plaque as if it were a colleague. The first birds made small questions that sounded like yes. He considered the day. Doors would open, names would be spoken, hands would be watched by other hands. The work would be simple, precise, and without hurry. If a rumor had lost its path, the valley would teach it to walk home. The sky brightened like linen lifted to dry. The inspection would begin at the first shadow. The village had slept with its tools within reach. The small servant stood at attention, ready to attend whichever threshold asked first. The story leaned forward, not with dread, but with the steady curiosity of houses that have taught their doors to remember promises. Dawn gathered along the ridge and laid a band of gold on the path. Sandals were tightened, headcloths were tied. The priest lifted his kit. Merritt carried tools. At first shadow they stepped forward together, prepared to open what must be opened and to close it well. At first shadow, the company formed at the gate. The foreman checked the list and weighed the pace. The guard settled a coil of rope across his shoulder and touched the jackal badge. Horry slid hymns and small texts into a leather roll. The priest lifted natron and a cone of perfumed fat. Merritt packed reed knives, paste, chalk and linen. Two masons carried pegs and levels. The carpenter laid a mallet across his arm. The boy counted wicks. The younger sister carried a copper bowl for threshold water. Merritt wrapped the small servant and set it in a shallow basket, so a day of doors would have a companion who understands how to listen. The first door belonged to a weaver. The seal sat true, and the rope remembered its knot. The family elder stood as witness, hands folded and gaze steady. The guard read the order and pressed a mud pellet to mark the time. The priest touched natron to lintel and jamb. The knot loosened, and the slab sighed like a place that keeps its promise. Inside, jars rested on painted stands, oils sealed, baskets dry, faience beads sleeping in trays. Horry read the owners' names. Merritt steadied a loose cornflower with a whisper of paste. Nesimoon wrote a tidy line. The door closed and received the jackal seal again. The second door honored a scribe who loved quiet lamps. Within, one jar wore a thin heat crack. Merritt laced it with linen and resin, neat as a sentence set where it belongs. Horry counted 4 linen packages, then found a 5th tucked under a bench, wrapped with care and forgotten. He recorded the surplus so lists would match what stones remember. The officials exchanged glances that softened into respect. The servant stood at the threshold, its little hoe resting on a shoulder, a small patience that taught larger patience. The officials nodded and watched the careful hands move together. A third doorway guarded a niche off the main way. A wooden tag had slipped and lay face down in dust. The carpenter rewound the thong and reset the label so names faced the room they named. The boy whispered the signs as if calling someone across water and grinned when the rope took its knot without a quiver. The priest spoke a brief line for places that learn again how to hold. Horry set down a neat note for families who would read later and feel their shoulders lower. Children peered from shade and learned how patience looks today. By mid-morning, the company reached a northern narrows where the wind remembered stone. A faint breath of resin lay at the next entry, as if incense had touched it at dawn. A fox print brushed dust near the jam and ended where rock hardens. The guard announced the opening with even tone. Inside, 3 canopic jars gleamed on a shelf, but the list promised 4. The officials stiffened. The family elder lifted his chin, pale but steady. Hori knelt and traced a darker lint of dust along the back. The boy noticed a crescent of shadow beneath a stone lip. The air held its careful hush. Merritt slid a reed into the gap and felt round clay. The foreman asked for pegs and rope. A small wedge freed the backboard, and a jar rolled forward with a hollow knock that sounded like relief. The tremor that moved the slab at the unused shaft had taught smaller things to shift as well. The stopper bore the right name. The officials let out their breath. The elder laughed once, softly, then covered his mouth from habit. The door closed with thanks rather than worry, and the record named the cause plainly. They rested in a curve of shade, where the cliff leaned like a shoulder. Water moved from hand to hand. The servant took a square of light and gave stillness back. The priest offered a line that praises places for keeping their shape. The guard drew a white stroke on stone to mark the path to the unused shaft, and rose. Sandals found their rhythm. The company stepped off again with the measured confidence of people whose work fits the day and whose steps teach dust to settle. 2 doors remained. The 5th lay near the chalked rope at that shaft. The valley spoke its low hold when a breeze slid from the mouth and steps lightened without command. At the chamber listed for inspection, the seal was clean and the mud firm. Inside, jars stood square and a modest shawabti chest nestled in the rear. Merritt tested a hairline seam and left it honest, preferring age that tells the truth to brightness that forgets. Hori read the names, the guard pressed the jackal, and the slab took its new seal as the room returned to proper shade. The last door bore the cones of Pauser, the painter whose quarrel with Kai lives as a small memory in ledgers. The seal showed a smudged edge, a thumb brushed across damp clay long ago. The guard tested the cord and found it proper. The priest spoke the line that asks the door whether it wishes to be opened today. Silence answered in the negative. The order required witness only. Hori wrote the note in a tidy hand. The officials were content to respect a door that wanted rest and to trust a village that knows how to hear such wishes. The walk home followed shade. Conversation unwound like rope set carefully into a coil. The officials asked about the plaque with the feather. Hori explained measure here and smiled at their nods. They asked about the little servant. Merritt answered that small tools make big promises possible. The guard added that a day with many thresholds benefits from one companion who never tires of standing in the right place. The boy counted the doors aloud, and the younger sister matched each count with a gentle tap on the copper bowl. They walked in pairs and let silence carry meaning between each door, step after step. At the shrine of the Lady of the West, the company paused. Mirrors calmed sun into a soft wash. The priest set the rescued jar on cloth and offered thanks for rumor resolved by patience and for shelves that remember their duties after the earth shrugs. The officials sealed their tablet and declared the inspection complete without insult. They would report that the valley held its order and that a jar was recovered from a pocket left by a small shift in stone, a lesson worth writing plain for anyone who trusts careful eyes. In the foreman's court, neighbors gathered with the quiet appetite of workers satisfied by clean effort. Bread and onions made a simple feast. The servant returned to its square, east to light. The boy recited the list of doors in order and smiled when he reached the end without error. The younger sister washed the copper bowl and polished the rim until water looked like glass. Hori placed the day's record among neat rolls. The foreman stood in the gateway and felt stones settle under his palm while evening began to cool the lane. The levee held. The canal slowed to normal speech. The unused shaft answered the guard's last look with a still mouth. In the lane, the plaque with the feather watched hands put tools away and seemed to steady wrists at the final knot. The officials slept with the ease of men who enjoy a clean table. Families touched door frames as they passed and felt wood accept the quiet. Night drew up from the river. Stars wrote their patient ledger above the ridge, and a jackal called, and a second voice answered at a distance without alarm. Doors owned their promises. Names sat level on their lines. The village rested, knowing the West and the living had kept a day of conversation without quarrel. In the foreman's court, the servant faced east and seemed to listen for the light that would arrive with morning. Beyond the ridge, the valley kept its breath. The river held its silver band. Somewhere a fox stepped softly and found no mischief to claim. The story gathered itself for the last turn, ready to carry weight with the same quiet strength that steadied a jar behind a shelf and taught busy hands to breathe. Dawn returned with a polish of gold along the ridge, and the village rose with it, steady as a line taught to breathe. The officials had gone, leaving a tablet sealed. The levee held, and the canal spoke in its ordinary voice. The unused shaft kept its quiet. The foreman walked the gate and touched the doorway plaque. The feather above the lintel kept wrists measuring. Children mimicked the gesture. Merritt set bowls in turning shade and stirred a plaster no door would need today. The younger sister sorted brushes and sang softly. The boy swept the court until dust lay low and polite. Hori arrived with a slim roll from the House of Life. He brought the record of the repaired cartouche and a letter from a northern scribe who had read with relief. "A pattern holds," the letter said. Hori smiled and set the roll with others that make a city sure. The guard joined them with a nod. By mid-morning, a messenger from the ferry asked for hands to greet a caravan from the east with cargo for the workshops. The foreman agreed. Thresholds receive as well as refuse. Men shouldered poles, women filled jars. The copper bowl for door water went along at the younger sister's steady pace. The small servant rode in its basket to keep company with entries that feel better when watched. The caravan reached the lane with the soft rattle of well-tied loads. Grain and timber lay beneath netting. The foreman checked each parcel. Hori read names and tallies. Merritt tested the timber's grain. Nesamun wrote a clean account. The guard kept the path open without fuss. When the last knot settled, the caravan master touched the feather and laughed that even strangers enjoy clear signs. Afternoon brought a request from the valley. The door of the elder's chamber had cooled and wanted a final greeting before it learned to be only a wall again. The priest asked for short company. The foreman chose the same companions who had steadied the beer. The family met them at the mouth with figs and a measure of water. Inside, air felt honest. The jars waited with still attention. The painted sky kept its stars. The priest sprinkled natron on lintel and threshold and thanked the door for its manners. He spoke to the small servant and returned it to Merritt's hands. He asked that the village keep the figure for their own thresholds because a useful tool deserves familiar work. They walked back. In the court, the servant faced east on its linen square. The mother with the new child paused to let the baby look. The infant's gaze caught the little hoe and brightened. The younger sister traced the name with a nail and did not smudge the ink. Toward evening, the overseer from the canal returned to report that the levee's seams held under full draw. He presented a small shell of bright silt, a gift from the river to the village that had steadied its edge. Merritt set the shell near the plaque, as if listening to water remember its promise. Hori wrote a brief note to accompany the shell in the archive. As the sun lowered, neighbors drifted to the shrine of the Lady of the West with mirrors wrapped in cloth. The priest set a shallow bowl where the last light could sift into it. The hymn that binds Mayat to doors was read again, not from worry but from gratitude. The foreman named works completed without quarrel. The guard named harms that had thought twice and walked away. Merritt named repairs that preferred honesty to gloss. Hori named records that let memory stand level. Then the priest spoke in the tone used when a lesson becomes a habit. He said a city is a house of doors. He said doors shape breath, and breath shapes names, and names teach hands. He said a small servant had shown how standing still can become work that travels through a place like water through reeds. He lifted the figure so the last light touched its face, then set it back facing east. Twilight gathered. A breeze carried the smell of wet clay. The copper bowl showed a coin of sky and then swallowed it. Children practiced tying the white knot. Women folded linen like maps. Men checked hinges by listening more than by touching. A dog turned and slept. A fox reconsidered a path and found kinder business along a field. Night rose and stars kept their ledger. The ridge made its dark line. In the quiet hour, the plaque above the gate seemed to glow with the memory of many hands. The shell of bright silt held the day's patience. The repaired cartouche lay in its chamber with edges calm. The shaft kept stillness that felt earned rather than empty. Before dawn, a heron lifted from the canal and drifted toward the river. Its wings made the measured beat that once taught a scribe to begin a line. The village woke to that rhythm, and the season answered with a generous breath from the water. The foreman opened the gate. The feather above the lintel waited with its lesson. Merit set out bowls. The younger sister laid the linen square. The boy arranged wicks. Hori unrolled the hymn. The guard touched the jackal on his chest. Work resumed, not as an ending, but as a promise kept in motion. The small servant stood where east could find its face and seemed to listen. Doors would open and doors would close. Names would sit level. Water would press and banks would answer. Jars would be counted and rumors taught to walk home. A city would hold because many hands agreed on simple things. When light reached the plaque, the village stepped through and the day accepted them. The story traveled with them, quiet, like a rope that learns every knot and never forgets the shape of the door it guards.